Welcome, everybody. My name is Alana Kaivalya, and I am so honored to be here today with Chaplain Andrew. And I want to let you know a little bit about how I met him and where I met him. And the first thing I want to say is that when I met him, it was really a kindred spirit. And I knew right off the bat that Andrew would be an important person in my life and somebody that I would want to bring into our larger community to talk about this very, very important topic. So I met Andrew during the death of my father at a hospital in California, and he was incredibly instrumental in helping me navigate that very difficult process. And what he helped to open my eyes to is how important being present for death and understanding death and accepting it is as our role as spiritual leaders. So as spiritual leaders, we have to work with people through not just the best and most momentous times of their lives, but also some of the most challenging times of their lives. And one of the things that you all hear me say over and over and over again is that as a yoga teacher, you are a spiritual leader. If you are here listening to this podcast, to this broadcast with me and Andrew today, then you recognize yourself in that role and you understand that people ask you about the bigger, more metaphysical questions of life. And whether or not, we asked for that, that's what we're here for. That's what they're calling us to do. And so I wanted to chat with Andrew about giving us some tools on how to do this better. One of the things I realized as I was going through the death of my father is how actually terrible we are as Westerners about accommodating death, being present for it, accepting it. So, hopefully he'll give us some things to do. And without further ado, thank you for being here today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to come on and chat with you a little bit about, as I'm smiling, I'm saying about death and dying.
Yeah. Well, I think that, one of the things I'd love for us to shift our perception of is that it is actually nothing to be afraid of. Fear is, anything that we're afraid of, we try to push away, we try to resist. But it's a part of life.
It's absolutely true. And I think we see that even in the way as a society we handle death, right? So yeah. I remember like my grandparents' era and before them, especially growing up in the South, like people died at home. They died in the living room or in their bedroom or somewhere like that, where it's now so much of that has shifted to the hospital. I mean, thankfully, we have the hospice movement where people aren't dying quite as much in the hospital. But yeah, people die in the hospital because it's hard, it's difficult, it's something that the professionals should handle, right? So like that specialization.
It's something that we should remove ourselves from.
Right. I mean, because we're all about,
we don't want to deal with it.
Right. Let the professionals deal with it. Let those people deal with it. Yeah. I'll step in as I have to and then step back out as quickly as I possibly can.
Right. Well, the reality is that, again, whether we like it or not, all of us will face death in our lifetimes. Some more often than others, some earlier than others, but we will all face it. It's a really interesting thing that you do. This job that you do is incredibly sacred. It's incredibly powerful. What drew you to this work?
I'd hit a point in my life where, I'll keep it brief. I got sober, right? That's just the short answer to the question was, I got sober. I couldn't live like that anymore. And as part of that process of really opening up to myself and just being alive and not using substances to numb my emotions. This
so
idea
tempting,
popped in my head. It has its days even still, right?
Yeah, sure.
But part of that process was this idea just popped in my head. It's what about chaplaincy? And I was like, I vaguely know of it. And so I started looking into it and it just seemed to click. Something just kind of clicked for me and it made sense. And I couldn't even articulate why at that time it made sense, but it just, that click, like, oh yeah, this fits.
It was a calling.
So, yeah, I know. I always hesitate to use that word. Growing up in a very conservative Southern Christian church was like the calling, and it has a lot of heavy language to it, and it makes you different and special and unique.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And somehow better than a lot of other people. So I don't mind the word. I just don't use it that much myself. but yeah, so yeah, I guess maybe I was enticed or called or drawn into chaplaincy. So,
Yeah.
and I like got into it. I loved it, and I haven't looked back.
You know, I started out that question with what you do is very sacred and it's very holy work. Um, and so, what would you say to someone like me, right? Or like the people listening, how do you open up to the sacrality of death? How do you open up to, like, this is a part of life. This is a part of something that I can be present for death. I can be present for the death of someone. I can be present for, this incredible transformation that's happening. What would be like the first step for somebody to start being okay with this?
That's a good question. So usually it's always a kind of appointment by necessity, like you said, right?
Right.
Because we are all going to face this part of what it means to be alive, this
Yeah.
dying process, right? And so, and what I mean by appointment by necessary is a lot of times it's with, the daughter, the son, the niece, the nephew of their loved one that's in the hospital, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a certain sense in which, like, just the reality won't let it be otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not so much, that draws them there. And so then my work a lot of times is to kind of keep them from running out of the room and running away terrified,
Right.
and just be a person who can sit there, and even just as sitting with it, and not, they see me not being overwhelmed or
Mm-hmm.
freaked out. It kind of normalizes the situation a little bit, right? So that
Yeah.
calm presence brings kind of a normalization. That's even a proper word,
No,
but
it is. It's actually, you know what? I mean, one of the things I've been talking about a lot over the last few months, and certainly over the last few weeks, is holding space. So, at the time that you and I are talking, our country, our society, our culture, our world is going through some pretty major shit. We
yes.
have a lot of social justice issues coming to the surface. We are dealing with, a once in every 100 years type of pandemic, and we are being faced with death on a daily basis in a greater
Mm-hmm.
amount than we were even a few months ago. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as we're watching all of these changes that I think for most of us are very uncomfortable, they're very uncomfortable. These are changes we don't want to face. These are changes we don't want to hang out with. But as spiritual leaders, we don't get to choose when or
No.
if we can hang out. We have to be present. We have to be here. And one of the biggest roles we have, in my mind, is holding space, is the
Mm-hmm.
ability to just hold space for things to happen, to allow the presence to occur in others as we create the container for it. And that's what you said, you get to be there and you get to be that presence
Mm-hmm.
so that the daughter, the son, the niece, the nephew, the family member, whomever it is, can be supportive, can be loving with the person who is going
Mm-hmm.
through the dying process, which is so important for that person who's going through the dying process. Ultimately, that's what that person needs.
Right, right. And then even the person themselves, right? So,
Yes.
one of the things I've run into a couple of times is, you have the mother, the grandmother, the aunt, the uncle, and the family's there. And it's clear from what the doctor is telling the family that, the patients, they're going to pass away. This is
Yeah.
terminal. They don't have much time. But the family says, I don't want to upset them. Almost a sense like if they tell them, it'll bring it on faster.
Mm.
Almost, like if we give them bad news, it's going to get their heart, elevated, and that's just going to be it sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've had one situation where the patient asked me directly, said, well, am I dying? And, I could have leaned back on the sense that, well, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a nurse and I can't give you the medical analysis. But I took a little different angle and I said, if you were, what would you want to say?
Mm.
And it kind of caught her off guard, and she thought about it, and we had a really open and lengthy conversation where, I didn't have to, I could shift and just ask her, what's important to you now? And
Yeah.
how can I hold that space for you to say what's important or tell what stories are important to you or reminisce about what things are important to you and give you that space. So
You guided her to acceptance.
exactly. And again, it wasn't that I was trying to hide anything from her. It was just, I knew I was in the midst of a conflict with the family. Like they
Right.
didn't want her to know.
Right.
And I thought, well, I can still have a great conversation and hold the space without having to step into their particular conflict.
Right. I think that's wonderful. I think that that's a really great, I think that that's really great for all of us to keep in mind who do this work, you know, that as we hold the space, I think we have a couple of goals, don't we, as space
Right.
holders, right? And I think one
Mm-hmm.
of the goals is to hopefully guide and lead toward a sense of acceptance or openness,
Mm-hmm.
potentially guide and lead toward a sense of inquiry, you know, asking
Mm-hmm.
questions about what's happening at that time, conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think in my experience, which of course is much more limited than yours, but being with my father during his dying process, the ability to tell story, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to say what is needed to be said. My father adamantly resisted his dying process. He didn't want to believe it was happening to him.
Right.
But I knew what was going on, and I knew that it would be important for him to say what he needed to say. And those conversations of allowing him to dictate to me, you know, letters to his family members were probably the most important moments that I spent with him as
Right.
he was on his way out. What else do you find is important for people as they're dying in terms of like how those around them can be supportive?
Um, you mean how can like family members or friends be supportive of the
Yeah, you
person
know, we're talking about
who's
like
passing?
acceptance, what to do, you know, maybe have them
Right.
tell stories.
And that's usually what I'll do. So, particularly in those cases where if a person's passing away and like they're not conscious, they're not awake, they're
Mm-hmm,
on machines, and I can't have a conversation with them.
mm-hmm,
Um, you know, I always speak to the person when I come into the room, um, even though, you know, whether they can hear me or not. But a lot of that I think helps open the door for the family. When I
yeah,
acknowledge this person in the bed that can't acknowledge me back, that for whatever reason, that drops some guard for them a lot of times. And as I
yeah,
get started in the conversation, you know, I'll say something like, you know, I really wish I could have gotten to know this person here, but you know, it doesn't look like I'm going to have the chance right now. So tell me a little bit about so-and-so. Like,
that's
tell
awesome.
me, are they a firecracker? Or are they a
Yeah,
wallflower? Or, you know, were they a
yeah.
hellraiser, shit stir, whatever it is, right? Like,
Uh-huh,
and it usually gets people talking, right? And if
yeah,
people tell these stories, telling stories is sacred work. I
yes
mean,
it is.
that's what we've been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, telling stories.
Mm-hmm,
And so getting people telling these stories, um, it gets them to open up and it gets them to these moments where they cry and they do say, I'm really going to miss them, or, and then they get it back together and they maybe have a quiet moment, or it reminds them of another story. So
yeah.
getting people to talk about their loved ones, and people don't mind talking about other ones because then they're not talking about their own feelings right
Right.
now. Right.
Well, I mean, in a way they are, you know, obviously
Exactly.
I'm very close to mythology. That's where
Mm-hmm.
my doctoral work resides. And the act of storytelling is a healing process. It is
Oh
a
my gosh.
therapeutic process, you know, so
Yes.
it's not like we have to sit down with a therapist and talk about our feelings in order to heal. The idea that you could tell stories, you know, I never question when I'm speaking to someone or asking them about their story or the story of a loved one or something, what story comes out. And I think that that is,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's a part of us, a deeper part of us that has the wisdom to know it's this story that needs to be told right now. It's this story that will be most healing right now. It's this story that I need to share right now. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
we're a little bit guided by that because when you walk into a room and you ask a family member, you know, share something with me about this person, there's a lifetime worth of stories to tell. and
Right.
why do they choose this one? Why do they want to tell you, about the
Mhm.
flower in the sidewalk that this person picked for them? Or why do they want to tell you about, the fact that they taught them to drive or whatever it is, right? There's
Mhm.
something in that person's psyche that needs that story at that moment. And so that's what comes out.
I think that's absolutely right, and sometimes that helps me kind of follow up and stay with them. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, that's interesting why you picked that particular story. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And that's absolutely what I find in my work with folks here in the hospital setting.
The other thing,
Um,
that I'm reminded of is something I heard just the other day is you only live as long as the last person who remembers you. And
I've heard
so
something akin to that. Yeah,
telling
that makes sense.
stories actually brings life. And
Hmm.
even if the person can't speak, even if the person is unconscious, even if the person is, hooked up to machines, as those stories are told, it's like they're given new life in a sense.
They are, because now they live within me and they live within whomever else hears those stories. And I take those stories, and I like that one of those words that comes from my tradition, right? My Christian traditions, or we call witness,
Yeah,
right? We
we have that
bear
in yoga
witness to
too.
something, right? So
Yeah,
we bear witness to that thing,
yeah,
this story that's being told. And now being a witness is, if you think about it from sort of like a legal perspective, there's a weight or responsibility, or there's
yes.
something attached to that, being a witness of
You make it
this
real
person.
by being
You
a
do,
witness.
you make it absolutely real. And
Yeah,
that's really powerful for a lot of people. Um,
absolutely.
right. So,
So, Andrew, one of the things that I noticed going through this process with my father was how how difficult it is for people to respond to the death of somebody, right? So, having a loved
mm,
one die, you kind of think, okay, well, are you going to receive cards? Are people going to reach out? I was really surprised at how many of those around me reacted with almost like putting up a wall. Like, I can't recognize the death of this family member of Alana's because it
mm,
means that then I make it real for myself. I might think about the death of my own father. I might, recognize how difficult death is for me. It's almost like they shut it off. And I think that one of the things I really wanted to make sure that we hit on today is how do we do a better job of honoring and supporting those who are going through the grieving process? Because the grieving process is real. And it
mm.
happens no matter what our relationship with a loved one was. It's very spontaneous. It can be a long process. So sometimes condolences happen directly after the death, but then 6 months later, nobody's checking up or following up. And yet this person is still grieving. How can we as spiritual leaders be more supportive during the process of grieving for someone else, for our clients, our friends, our family? What can we do?
So, first part, what I'll say is, yes, your experience and what you're talking about is right on. Because we're so uncomfortable with death,
Mm-hmm.
we we want to say something. We feel almost compelled to, and because we're Americans, do something, right? We're
Yeah,
very do kind of culture, right?
yeah,
So, but that's the hard thing. There's nothing to do, right? Like I can't fix it. I can't change it. I can't
right.
make it better. Like, and so one of the first things is just to acknowledge and say, and I've said this before, depending on the family who's there, I say, I'm
Just breathe.
sorry.
Yeah,
Right. Like that was really shitty.
yeah.
And just say what it is. It's almost as though you pull the curtain away to
Mm-hmm.
reveal the big bad monster behind the curtain when you just
Mm-hmm.
say, like, I'm sorry your mom died. And there's nothing else to say, and that's the hard part, is that there's
Yeah.
nothing else to say. And part of holding the space is me being quiet and holding the space. And I think a lot of people have a difficult time with the sitting in silence with
Yes.
uncomfortable feelings,
Absolutely.
right? And
Yeah.
so if you can just be aware of that within your own self
Well,
and
that's
just
why
know that,
meditation
like,
is so hard.
yeah, right.
Like, but I think that
Right.
Yeah, that's why it really is. I think my next question for you is, how do we prepare ourselves to be the kind of container that can hold that space? One of the things I would obviously recommend, seems obvious now, is meditation, right? That if we
Mm-hmm.
can sit with ourselves and be uncomfortable with ourselves for a moment, we can
Mm-hmm.
process that. It will be easier for us then to hold that for others. But what else do you think we can do?
Um, some of the things are a little different now because of COVID.
Yeah,
I think human touch is helpful.
yeah,
Um, a hug, a holding of a hand, um, some sort of, but that physical human presence, and just giving yourself the time to just, if you walk into a situation prepared that you're going to have some uncomfortable feelings, and that what
hmm
you need to do is be quiet through those feelings, at least you're a little bit more prepared to go through it,
right,
right? And also give yourself some grace and a little bit of a break. If you can only really sit with that for 10 or 15 minutes and excuse yourself to just go to the bathroom or something and come back, you don't have to break up the time with a lot of chatter, or bring up another topic.
right,
Give yourself the space to know, okay, I need to tap out for a second, and then just kind of quietly tap out and then come back, right?
right,
Don't interrupt the space because you're so uncomfortable that you had to tap out.
right.
And I think that's one thing for people who are struggling with what to do. I think that's acknowledge your own discomfort and sitting with it,
hmm
and realizing that if you do need to tap out, it doesn't need to be a giant signal. It doesn't have to be announced. It doesn't have to break up anything for you to just take a break and come back in quietly. And that makes a big difference for people as well,
Absolutely.
because um, it doesn't shift the focus away from what the purpose of the held space is for, right? Which is
Right.
to acknowledge this loss and maybe shock or very, very early grief or whatever it is. Death is unspeakable. When somebody dies, there's nothing to say.
Yeah. I'm just gonna pause on that for a second, because I think that that's so true. There is nothing to say. I think getting close to that, opening up to that, holding space for that, that's the real work of spiritual leadership in this capacity.
Mhm.
Um, it is the ultimate discomfort, right? One of the things we talk about a lot in yoga is leaning up against the sharp edges, right? So, and this is like all day, every day, like just
Right.
general
I
life,
like that.
all the time. It's actually, I was very blessed and lucky that one of my very first yoga teachers taught me that, that we lean up against the sharp edges, because the more comfortable you can be in uncomfortable situations, just the more comfortable you'll be in general. But the reason why you want to practice and get used to being uncomfortable, to not push away the discomfort, is actually to prepare for death. I've had
Mm-hmm.
many of my yoga teachers say that the practices of yoga are practices to prepare for death. If
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's ever been to a yoga class, what's the final pose that you do? Do you know, Andrew? Have you been to a yoga class?
Savasana, right?
Exactly, which is what?
You're laying down on your back,
It's corpse
eyes
pose.
closed.
Shavasana is
Oh,
corpse pose. It's actually the time for you during a class to die. And the purpose of it is that you want to let go, right? Death is the ultimate letting go. And over and over, it doesn't matter what kind of yoga practice you employ, you want to release. You want to release your hold on the pleasure that you seek. You want to release the hold on the addictions that hold you. You want to
mm.
release your grasp on how things should be. You want to release your grasp on being comfortable. And when you're in Shavasana, it's actually a very physical, practical, performative way of like, okay, I'm going to be here. I'm going to try to release my muscles. I'm going to try to release my tension. I'm going to try to release the hold on my breath. Because if I can do it a little bit here, it's like testing things out. That when I go into my real life, right? And there's something I have a hold on. I've already gotten a little bit of practice on how to let go because I've done, shavasana or meditation or whatever yoga
Right.
practice is helping me to release and let go. So that if you get really practiced at hanging out with change, hanging out with the discomfort, hanging out with the death, whether it be the actual physical death of a loved one or the death of an idea, the death of a business, the death of a relationship. Dying is around us all the time.
Right.
That when we get to the end, right, the real letting go, it won't be so difficult. It will be a release. There's a very sacred mantra that talks about death as the release, like a cucumber is released from its stalk, which my grandparents grew cucumbers in their backyard because my grandfather made his own dill pickles.
Oh, wow.
And when a cucumber gets fat enough, if you don't pluck it prematurely, it just sort of falls off from the stalk, and then you can't actually tell which side was ever attached.
Oh.
It looks like as if it was self-made, essentially whole and complete.
Right.
So that if you know yourself as whole and complete, that there is nothing that is attaching you, what is there really to let go of? And I think that to me, from a yogic perspective, that's the beauty that I see in death, and I think that our resistance to death is the resistance to change, is the resistance to letting go, whether it's our resistance to letting go of a person in front of us who's dying or our own death, letting go of what we may not have achieved, done, accomplished, missed out on in this lifetime.
I think so. I mean, as you're talking, I'm hearing some of the things I really experienced early on in early sobriety for myself, right? Which was this sense of this, I would practice these little things and I would go to these meetings, these AA meetings. I would practice something or I might say it out loud for the first time. And I realized that I could kind of hold whatever I'd found there for a little bit of time outside of that meeting, right? And then I noticed that I could hold whatever I had found there for a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. And I could take that with me throughout my day, right? And if you know anything about 12-step programs, it's so much about letting go, letting go, letting go. I mean, it really is a mantra. And so, yeah, that sense of letting go of control and expectations and is a big part of that, right? And I think you're right. Like, so at first I called it people who had done the work, because you can tell the difference between the people who have practiced dying to the illusion of like having a lot of control over our lives, and
That's a
the
good
people
one.
who and the people who haven't practiced that dying throughout their life in different circumstances. And you can it makes a big, huge difference once you're facing that kind of final death of well, maybe not final, but the death of our body, right? You could the people who have practiced, you can tell immediately, and it makes my work different, not easier, just different. I get to join them in a different kind of way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I as I said, I've been having conversations that feel very similar to this quite a lot over the last few months, just with everything that's going on. And one of the things that I consistently say over and over is that, as a teacher, as a spiritual leader, you can only bring people as far as you yourself have gone. So, if as a spiritual leader, you wish to be present and hold space for people going through the grieving process, and I'm telling you now, those of you listening, you will have to do that. You can't avoid it. This is part of life. If you've chosen work in this arena, like, it's going to happen. And I highly recommend that you get real with yourself and really get into being able to hold this space, not just so that you can be supportive of those that you love, students you love, the community members you love, your loved ones, but it is essential and important for your own spiritual growth to be able to do this. And so as you work with the idea of letting go, of allowing those little deaths every day to occur within your life, it will allow you to hold the space a bit better for others.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What are some of the things that you do to prepare for your day, Andrew? Like, how do you, because, I talk too about, like, as yogis, we want to make yoga our normal. The thing that's special about yoga isn't that psycho-spiritual state of yoga, which is also called enlightenment. Everybody can do it. Everybody's experienced it. We've all had those flashes of connection. That's not the special piece. The special piece is actually being able to sustain that for longer and longer periods of time, right?
Right.
As you talked about, like, you were able to kind of hold it through your day, and then you're able to hold it a little bit longer. So what are the kinds of things that you do to get ready for your work?
One of the first things I do most mornings is I meditate. I have a
big thumbs up.
I do, right?
We love meditation.
I have a necklace that my brother-in-law brought me back from a trip, 108 bead
yes.
Necklace I use most mornings. I have a few standard kind of things that I will kind of speak out into the world, whether it be kind of a prayer or an intention for the day. And then I try to just, like I said, carry that with me throughout the day. In those moments where I feel myself getting upset, I still use serenity prayer a lot.
That's a good one.
And give myself permission to take breaks as I need it, and just recognizing that I might be feeling overwhelmed, and give myself space to do that, because I don't want to bring that into somebody else. Into their
exactly.
space as much as possible.
You can't bring it into their space.
Right. But then a lot of my morning is also just disrupted by my 8-year-old, right? So it's not like
wait, you have like a life, like an actual life?
Yeah, it's not all what some people would consider like super spiritual and it's quiet. And I have my tea and my incense, or my prayer book and journal and my Bible. If I'm like, no. I get about 20 minutes and then my kid is up and my day is going. So, and she doesn't want to listen.
I have to tell you, the way that you prepare for your day is pretty much exactly the way that I prepare for mine. And we are doing the work of spiritual leadership. You're doing it in a really unique and special way, and I'm doing it in my own unique and special way. But being a spiritual leader is being a spiritual leader is being a spiritual leader. And whether, the sacred book that you crack open is the Bible or the Yoga Sutra, whether the meditation that you do is with a rosary or mala beads, whether the prayer that you say is in English or in Sanskrit, these are the things that work, that help you to walk the path of the spiritual leader. Whether you are walking in to face people every day who are dealing with grief and death and dying, whether you're walking in every day to teach people to become yoga teachers, whether you're walking every day to just, teach a yoga class, spiritual leadership requires you to do your own work. And it's actually, you fit it in wherever you can. I like to say that, yoga doesn't make your life better. Like practicing yoga, suddenly things aren't going to be sparkles, rainbows, and butterflies. Yoga makes you better at your life. Yoga makes you better at your life, so that as your life is happening, when the 8-year-old is fussing around, when the dog is freaking out because there's a thunderstorm outside, and that actually is happening right now. There was a huge crash of thunder a moment ago. I don't know if you heard it, but
I didn't know.
Yeah, so like no matter what is happening, your life will continue to go on, and you cannot ignore it. You cannot say no to it. Spiritual practice gives you the resiliency to handle it. And it will give you the resiliency to even handle the most challenging things that we face in this life, which is the death of someone that we love.
Yeah. Right. I think that's absolutely right. And is this sense of, whether it be yoga, Christianity, religious practice, spiritual practices in general, regardless of their religious nature, right? They don't make life better. They make us better equipped to handle life, right? Yeah. And then, but the big part of that is we also learn through that process when we give up what we had thought was control, which we learn is really just superficial control.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the ego.
Right. And then we can take it. I know. But then we learn about a deeper, more powerful control, right? Which is our ability to move through the world and not be so fearful and afraid. And then taking that out on other people makes us, the real control is how I can respond as opposed to react.
It's moving from fear to love.
Exactly.
When we move away from fear and toward love, I mean, I think that, I don't know that we have control over much of anything.
No, I
think that you would agree. But I think that if I would like to think that I am in control of something, the only thing that I believe that I have control over on a daily, regular basis is the strength of my connection to spirit. how much am I going to hold that? If I can hold that connection, then I don't have to control anything else. Mm-hmm. If I can do what I need to do to maintain an open heart, stay with love over fear, then everything can be out of my control and I will move through things well with grace. Mm-hmm. And that's all we want in any moment is grace.
Because you can trust that that connection is going to hold up. It's going to make it through it. Yeah. Right.
And that everything is as it should be in this moment. Even if we don't want it to be in that way, it still is as it should be in this moment.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up a little bit, but I want to kind of close out with, we have tackled an incredibly important topic today in our conversation. And, obviously, thank you for the work that you do. You made a huge impact in my life. And so I'm very glad that you get to make an impact in the lives of the listeners on this podcast. I think, I don't want to be cheesy, but where is the hope? Where is the hope? How do we face something as difficult and challenging as death? And how do we face it with radiance, with grace? I had the incredible good fortune through, I had the incredible good fortune that through my father's death, I had 20 years of spiritual practice behind me. And so I was able in that moment, to the best of my ability at that time, to stay present, to bring as much love and light as I possibly could to that experience, to let him tell stories, to just witness what was happening and not resist it. And, I'm not superhuman. I'm not saying I did it, right or anything. I'm saying that when I look back on that experience, I am super fucking grateful that that's the kind of experience that I had, and it's something that I would like for those listening to this to know that it's possible, and maybe there's the hope, but how do we give people who are dealing with grief, death, and dying, which is happening on a larger scale right now than it has probably in most of our lifetimes, how do we find the hope in that?
Yeah, so the cheesy question.
It is.
I appreciate that. So first I want to say, you thank me for my work, but I also, thank you for letting me journey with you, right? Yeah. So I'm also always very aware that, I get to be a part of your and your dad's story, right? And even though it's a small chapter, a small piece, it was a kind of a pivotal moment. And so I always say thank you. And so which kind of leads me to the first part of like, where's the hope, is gratitude, right? And so one of the things that you mentioned, right, was you were thankful that you had those 20 years of spiritual practice, right? And for you, that was important. And so maybe for somebody who doesn't have 20 years, they might have 6 months or whatever it is, and they might have a lot of good years with that parent or that loved one or that family member or that friend, and they can be grateful for that. Even though it's always too soon, I'm grateful for the time that I had, right? But I'm not talking about gratitude in terms of like, well, let's look on the rosy side. I'm talking about, not that something that's going to bring a smile to my face. I'm talking about the things that even in the midst of this hard thing, I'm glad that this person was in my life for some kind of reason. So, and again, that's probably not going to be the first thing that's going to pop to our mind. And for some people it is.
But if we can remember that, it will bring some ease.
It does. It's like, this was far too soon and this was horrible, but I'm glad I actually got to be a part of your life, whomever that is, right? For whatever time that I had, right? I'm grateful for that. I would have liked more, but I'm thankful that what I got it all, right?
And even, I have to say, on the flip side too, sometimes we experience death of a person that we wished wasn't in our life, or that, was challenging. And I think even in those moments, to have gratitude of like, even though this person maybe taught me what not to do, even though this person was an incredible difficulty in my life, like those challenges, those rubs, those discomforts, those sharp edges
Right.
have brought me to
And
where I am.
right. And there's always a sense in which there's a lot of complicated family relationships, right?
Yes.
And particularly with parents, right? It's hard.
Yep.
If for nothing else, you're grateful that this person helped usher you into the world, right? And that you're here, and that it's part of your existing. I learned a lot about that gratitude from so my wife grew up in Japan.
Oh, cool.
And and so part of they express gratitude really differently than we do here in the States. And one of those ways is whenever you're even getting ready to throw something away that we would consider to be trash, you can say thank you to that. You say, thank you for serving this purpose in my life during this time. And even though I'm getting ready to throw it away, thank you for what you have done. Right.
That's
and so
really
just
nice.
kind of expanding that acknowledgement that the time, this is where we are in this time, but I'm grateful for having you. And so just saying thank you. And the other thing I keep, this idea of hope is just, it's a way through. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be ethereal or theoretical. It's just a way through. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part about spirituality, is it has such a big impact, but it's through like not complicated and seemingly very small, like unsophisticated things, right? Say thank you and look for a way through.
It's beautiful.
And you're like, that's it? And you're like, yeah, that's it. I mean, that's the graduate level.
Boom, PhD. Thanks, everybody.
But it's the walking it out. It's the walking it out.
You know, it reminds me of a story, if I may, actually. Yeah. So I teach a lot of yoga, and I was teaching a group of people who, I was teaching them about the Yoga Sutra, and the Yoga Sutra is one of our most sacred texts in the yogic discipline. And in this Yoga Sutra, it outlines 5 things that are obstacles to our experience of yoga as a state of mind all the time. Right? So yoga will say that, you know, we all the time are whole, complete, and connected. We just forget. We have 5 things that prevent us from remembering our natural state of wholeness, completion, and connectedness. And the 5th thing, the most powerful thing that really blocks us from this wholeness and completeness, according to the Yoga Sutra, is the fear of death. And so I said this to this group of people, you know, that the reason why, you know, you cling so much to your life, which you think is based on your ego, and you're so fearful of death that you forget to really live, is kind of the whole thing. And somebody in the back raised their hand. His name was Joe. And he said, Alana, he said, I don't mean to take issue with, you know, you and Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutra, but I think you're wrong. I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, and this is true. His name is Joe Kitta. He wrote a book about this, and I wrote about him in one of my books too. He said, you know, he said, after 9/11, he said, I was afraid of everything. And so what I wanted to do was conquer my fears. So I took my 10 biggest fears, and of course, how does anyone conquer fear? They have to do the thing that scares them.
So you face it.
Right? That's the only psychological way proven to conquer any fear. So he was afraid of heights, so he learned to skydive. He was afraid of public speaking, so he joined a comedy improv group. He was afraid of dying, so he hired an aging circus performer to strap him to a circular board and throw knives at him. And he has a little mark on his head where one of the knives missed, and he's got a scar.
Oh, wow.
And he said, you know, that wasn't the scariest thing. He said, on that day that I thought I was going to die because the circus performer was going to throw knives at me, I had my family there, and I was able to say goodbye. And I knew that I loved them. I knew that they loved me, and I was prepared for whatever was going to happen. He said the scariest thing was actually, he was afraid of being alone. And so he lives in Pennsylvania, and the the idea of solitary confinement as we use it in the prison systems now actually comes from a Quaker idea that if someone in the Quaker community did something wrong, essentially they would be put in this conical structure with a hole at the top so that the light would come through, and then it would be the light of God shining upon them. And they would be left inside that conical structure for a period of maybe 3 days to kind of, it's like sitting in the corner, so, sit and think about what you've done, right?
Right.
And so he actually arranged to go spend, I think he was going to be there for 3 days inside this conical structure to be alone, to be completely cut off. No phones, no nothing. Food was arranged to be delivered, but that was it. He didn't make it past 24 hours. Because to him, the fear of disconnection was so acute. And I think it is for all of us as humans, okay? And, there's a lot of various psychological tests where, and I remember studying psychology, and they showed me, these horrible videos of monkeys who are in a test scenario where, the baby monkey is raised with its mom, a baby monkey is in a room being raised by a stuffed mother, and then a baby monkey in a room with the wire-framed mother. And the baby in the room with its mom does fine and is well adjusted. The baby in the room with the stuffed mother develops such psychological distress that it has to be put down. And the baby monkey in the room with the wireframe mother, where there's literally no softness at all, dies on its own in this test. And it just proves that we are social creatures. We are, our deepest desire is for connection. And when I heard this, it dawned on me that it is not actually death itself that freaks us out. It's the idea that we might be disconnected from this person, that in death we would not be able to reach out, or that when someone dies, we would not be able to talk to them. And I think that, one of the things that spiritual structures or religious structures give us are the ability to connect even beyond death. I know that I can talk to my dad. I know that he's in my heart. I know that he sees me. And I think that it's easier for us as we move into a dying process of our own to know that we will be in some way connected, that would facilitate us letting go. So that's my story.
Thank you. I mean, I like that. It makes a lot of sense. And connection. I mean, that's we can't over discuss connection in the midst of this pandemic that we're going through, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's it's a huge part of people being afraid of dying alone, right? That's why we have programs called No One Dies Alone,
right?
Where volunteers come and just sit with people, because that human connection is so powerful. And how else can you tell stories, or how else can you do these meaning-making behaviors? You can't do them by yourself in a vacuum, right? It requires other people. And I think that's the other thing. You said, where's the hope? It's connection, right? But that's difficult because, like you said, a lot of our friends, keep us kind of at arm's length, or after a certain amount of time, it should be okay now.
Right.
But if you can find some people in your circle, or develop some folks through grief groups or something like that, find those connections. I think that's a key driver of that hope, is that you're not alone. You're not going through this by yourself, and just that, everybody has to go through this. Not like that's a cold response, but just a sense of like, no, you're not alone through this, right? You have other people who are going through this, and you can do it together, right? So that connection that's probably the lifeblood of any kind of tips or topics, or tips or techniques or anything like that. Is without connection, I mean,
this process is impossible.
I think so. I really genuinely think so.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Well, Andrew, I'm so glad that I was able to connect with you. not just today, but during my own process of grieving and losing my father. So thank you for that. And before we close
Thank
out
you.
here, where can people find out more about your work, about hospice work, if that's something that they're interested in? Where can they connect with you?
So I am on social media. I have a Facebook page as well as an Instagram page. My Instagram handle is ACAMPBE4.
Say that again.
Like ACA. So it's
Uh-huh.
like Andrew Campbell,
Uh-huh.
but replace the two L's at the end with a number 4.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So like A can't be 4. You can find me as Andrew Campbell on Facebook. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me if someone's
Yeah.
looking to. And then in terms of hospice, I can send you some links. I can't think of any particular organizations right off the top of my head in this moment, but if you want, I can send you some links to different hospice end of life resources and materials you can post with the YouTube video
Okay,
for
that sounds
folks.
great. I would love to do
Yeah,
that. Awesome.
yeah. So thank you, and thank you again for letting me be part of you and your dad's journey, and even maintaining this connection even now. So thank you as well.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Mm.